Hi, I'm Pastor Steve Talmage of Love of Christ Lutheran Church in Mesa, Arizona. And Pastor Nanette Christofferson and I seek to provide brief introductions to the weekly lectionary lessons assigned for each Sunday of the church year. Today, I want to look at the Old Testament reading for Reformation Sunday, October 25th, 2020. It's Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34. It's a very brief reading. The context of this is Jeremiah is speaking to the exiles in Babylon. Jerusalem and the temple have been destroyed. Jeremiah is believed to have been part of the group that went to exile in the diaspora of Babylon. And here he brings a word of hope. He points to a time when the people of God will be able to return back to Jerusalem. The exiles have an opportunity to have a second chance from God, a chance to be that blessing that God intended from the very beginning when God started with Abram and Sarai, making that infamous promise in Genesis 12 that through them a nation would be formed that would be blessed by God, that in turn would be a blessing to the whole world. They have another chance to be placed back into the promised land that has not been so easy for God to get them there a couple of times. And though they failed to follow the original covenant of not chasing after other gods, the first commandment of the 10 that Moses received was, "You shall have no other gods before me." And we know over and over again, idolatry, chasing after other gods, was the downfall of the various kings of both the southern and northern kingdoms of Israel. But we hear through this little passage that God will not be stopped from the saving work that God started in the beginning. But this new opportunity is going to require heart surgery. Dr. Terence Fredheim writes, "It is important not to isolate this text from its context. The new covenant is to be accompanied by a repopulation of the land that was left and a rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem." The context of this verse, or these verses, is earthly. This covenant is earthly. It's not some heavenly in the sweet by and by. The covenant is given to Israel, not to some new people that God will create. Indeed, God will make a new covenant with all Israel, including northern and southern kingdoms. The promise is given to a dispirited people. Again, they've been exiled. Everything that they held dear has been lost. Unless the new covenant is God's promise for this specific group of people, it is a promise for no one else. To interpret this text in some sort of individualistic or universalistic or narrowly spiritual terms violates the context of Jeremiah's words. This is the only Old Testament passage where new modifies the word covenant. What is new about this covenant is disputed. This covenant is explicitly said not to be like the one that God made with Israel at Mount Sinai. That's the giving of the tablets of the Ten Commandments with Moses. The new covenant is linked neither to Mount Sinai nor to the Exodus event itself. The return from exile is a newly constitutive event for Israel, and the new covenant is an accompaniment integral to that event. This covenant will be made by God after those days, after Israel's return to the exile. Now, in our reading, we don't know when this event's going to happen, but in history, we do know King Cyrus of Persia issued an edict that any exiles or those descendants of exiles of Israel were free to return about 50 years after the original exile began and the fall of Jerusalem happened in 586 BCE. What this constitutive event entails for Israel was spelled out in Jeremiah chapter 24, verses 6 to 7. God will build and plant them, and give them a heart to know that I am the Lord. Replacing the evil will or heart, because will and heart are the same in Hebrew mindset, so characteristic of Israel's life before the exile, is going to be necessary. Again, heart surgery will be necessary. The old covenant formula of relationships still applies. God says, I will be their God, and they shall be my people, in verse 33 of our lesson. But Israel will now be constituted as the people of God in a new way. God will give them a new heart so that they will know the Lord. Indeed, all the people will know the Lord. God will be their husband, and the word in Hebrew for husband is Baal. And one of the great competing deities or idols that the people of Israel chased after was entitled Baal. It was a great premier fertility god. But in this context, God says, I'm going to become the husband of the people of Israel. I'm going to bind myself in a marriage covenant. My fidelity to Israel be like a husband to a bride. And they're going to know me. They're going to know me through the consummation of this covenant in a way that a husband and wife get to know each other intimately in a marriage relationship. In the next chapter, chapter 32, verses 38 to 41, we hear that the knowledge that God is going to give them, it's going to change the way they see God. In verses 38 to 41, I read, chapter 32, they shall be my people, and I will be their God. I will give them one heart and one way, that they may fear me for all time, for their own good, and the good of their children after them. I will make an everlasting covenant with them, never to draw back from doing good to them. And I will put the fear of me in their hearts, so that they may not turn from me. I will rejoice in doing good to them, and I will plant them in this land in faithfulness with all my heart and all my soul. Note that as Israel returns, as they live in this new covenant or new relationship with God, God remains responsible for keeping the covenant. God will never stop doing good and will instill in them a deep sense of fear, not being afraid of God, but place within them a sense of awe of God, that God is so committed to them, so marvelous to them, so that they do not revert to their old ways or old habits. In many ways, it appears God is upping the stakes on God's end. God appears to be going all in to complete and fulfill what God started from the beginning. The law remains a key point of continuity between the old and new, but it will be written upon the heart. No longer a written Torah will be necessary, and new in much of its content in order to fit in this new living situation. The repeated for in verse 34 of our reading gives two reasons why teaching will no longer be needed. They will know God, and God will forgive their iniquity. That all will have a knowledge of the Lord, and God will forgive are the center of this new covenant in Jeremiah. Israel's past becomes truly past. Never again need they wonder whether God would remember their sins. Everyone, from whatever class or status, from priest to peasant, from king to commoner, from child to adult, will know the Lord. So I ask a couple of questions. What difference might it make for you or the people around us to know this God of second chances, who promises unending fidelity and will not hold our past offenses against us? How might living in relationship to the God Jeremiah describes shape and influence the way we live in community with others? Dr. Charles Aaron Jr. writes, "We are most ready to hear these words when our own efforts are exhausted. When we are weary of our inner turmoil, we are ready to hear Jeremiah. When we are weary of broken relationships and the uncertainty of trusting others, we are ready to hear Jeremiah. When we are weary of our intermittent relationship with God, occasionally close but more likely far away, we are ready to hear Jeremiah. If we have tried to shake off a bad habit, or when we're tired of trying to improve ourselves, we are ready to hear Jeremiah. A question: how liberating is it for you to believe that God is the primary actor in the words of the prophets? The people, including you and me, are the beneficiaries of this God who promises to be made known and to forgive. Though it is presumptive to think Jeremiah was pointing to Jesus in the future, as Christian, we see God's action, we call it grace, is really the only hope we have. As Lutherans, this new covenant shifts the focus from our obedience and our attempts at trying to prove our worthiness or seek God's acceptance, is revealed in our sharing in the Lord's Supper. In the Gospel of Mark chapter 14, verse 24, Jesus said to his disciples, "This is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many." Jesus' self-giving love of his body and his blood puts on our hearts the assurance that God will accomplish what God has sought to do from the beginning. And through Jesus, we will know who God really is. And we can trust in the assurance that forgiveness has been provided. God bless you in the days ahead.